weekend, I went to a new church. So it was this weekend. It was called Kidlington Baptist Church in Oxfordshire. And this was my placement church while I was training for Baptist ministry. And when I arrived, I noticed something. Kidlington Baptist Church had, if I remember correctly, 4 guitarists. And yes, sometimes they'd all play at the same time. And straight away I realised that this church probably wouldn't need me to serve by playing the guitar and being involved in their music. And this was a real shock to the system, because I'd been leading music at my home church most weeks, and sometimes at multiple services a week for many years. I then realised that at Kidlington Baptist Church there were lots of preachers, and that I would only be asked to preach maybe 3 times a year. And again, this didn't seem very much to me, because I was used to preaching quite frequently at my home church. So how did they want me to serve? Well, the minister suggested that I simply go along to their 20s and 30s group. I was 19 at the time, by the way. To lead the group? No. Just to be with the people. And that didn't sound like service at the time, but I did it. And I wonder now if it was a kind of service, showing up for those people, listening to their highs and their lows, praying with them. And I later went on to be involved in many things, culminating in baptising 2 of the teenagers at the church and preaching at their baptism service. But it all began, not with that, but it all began with the humbling experience of service through showing up for people. And looking back now, I think it taught me a lot. That I'm not indispensable, and that there are different kinds of service and seasons of service. And this humbling experience clarified in my mind that I am a servant of the church and not a master of the church. I was called to be helpful in the ways that particular church needed at that time. I had to hold my so-called gifts lightly and let go for a season of some of the ways that I'd served in the past. And I think that shapes how I see ministry at Worthing Baptist Church to this day. I imagine that there might be a time when I preach less here and lead music less here, perhaps to support others as they grow in these areas of ministry. I hope so. But I hold it all lightly. We're going to hear some teaching of Jesus now, and it's on the subject of service. So Ant is going to come and serve by reading for us. Luke 17, 5 to 10.
The apostles said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." He replied, "If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it will obey you. Suppose one of you has a servant ploughing or looking after the sheep. Will he say to the servant when he comes in from the field, 'Come along now and sit down to eat'? Won't he rather say, 'Prepare my supper, get yourself ready and wait on me while I eat and drink. After that you may eat and drink'? Will he thank the servant because he did what he was told to do? So you also, when you have done everything you were told to do, should say, 'We are unworthy servants, we have only done our duty.'"
So our reading, it starts with this group of disciples, known as the apostles, asking Jesus to increase their faith. Let me just share a bit of context. Hopefully it'll make more sense of the reading. So the word apostle, it means the one who is sent. The one who is sent. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus handpicked 12 of his disciples to be apostles. And in Acts, which is Luke's sequel to his Gospel, we could call it Luke 2, Acts, the apostles are the ones who share good news with people about Jesus and plant churches of people who have received that good news. And after planting a church, an apostle would often move on. But as we see from much of our New Testament, apostles would often write pastoral letters, like Romans, 1 Corinthians. They'd write these pastoral letters to the churches to teach and encourage them. And so apostles didn't just start Christian communities, they also nurtured them. If you've ever had a go at starting something, perhaps a business or a charity or a creative project or a renovation of a home or a band or a new group or a community, I think the apostles' request will make sense to you. Increase our faith. Increase our trust. Increase our belief, because we can't see yet whether we have what it takes to get this thing off the ground. Who knows if it's going to fly? Makes me think of when we came back from the pandemic. Were you going to turn up? Mike and I, we didn't know. The leadership team, we didn't know if anyone would turn up. It might have just been us here. Increase our faith, Lord. That's a prayer to pray when you don't know whether something is going to fly. So how does Jesus respond to this request? It's really interesting. He says, don't worry, basically. Don't worry. You don't need heaps of faith. He says, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mulberry tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it will obey you. And this is obviously a command that the apostles, they're never going to make. Who wants to uproot a tree and plant it in the sea? I wonder if Jesus is joking with his disciples, and this joke is kind of lost in translation. He's having a bit of a laugh. You've got plenty of faith. You've got plenty of faith to be my apostles. Even a tiny bit is enough for you to command something completely pointless and impossible, and it would happen. If you can get a mulberry tree with deep roots off the ground and into the sea, then you can get a fledgling church off the ground easy. And not because of who you are, but because of who God is. In the next chapter of Luke's Gospel, Jesus says, what is impossible with man is possible with God. So Jesus is saying, the request, increase our faith, is not the right request. It's not the right request for them at this time. A tiny amount of faith in an awesome God is plenty enough. So Jesus is both correcting and encouraging his disciples simultaneously. You don't need more faith. Rather, you need to refocus on the kind of God you serve. But then Jesus offers this illustrative story. And it's hard to see how exactly it connects with the apostles' request for an increase in faith. I'll paraphrase the story. Jesus says, if you are a master who has a servant, do you plan to cook dinner for the servant when he gets in from ploughing or looking after the sheep? No. After the servant gets back from working in the fields, he also needs to cook dinner and serve it to you. Only after can he eat. And would you show copious gratitude for him doing so? No, because the servant isn't going above and beyond. The servant is just doing his job. And then Jesus applies the story. These are the words. So you also, when you have done everything you were told to do, should say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done our duty. Just on the Friday, I met up with some people in Oxford, and two of them had degrees in theology, and one of them was a regular preacher, but none of them had heard Jesus say this before. They asked me what I was preaching on, and I said this little illustrative story, and they said, we've never heard of that. We've not heard that story. That's such an obscure part of Scripture. And if you're anything like me, you might feel a little bit disheartened by these verses. Because isn't Jesus all about inviting us to a lighter way, a freer way, a way of love and mercy? What's all this about duty? That feels so heavy. I think in order to make sense of this, we need to remember who Jesus is talking to. He's talking to the apostles, the future leaders of the church. The New Testament, it often talks about Christian ministry in terms of service, working in the field, shepherding. The servant who works in the field, ploughing and shepherding, is the future leader of the church. So what message is Jesus trying to impart? See what you think of this. I wonder if Jesus is warning the apostles about the possibility that one day they could wrongly assume that their period of service has ended and that they have earned the right through their service to be served by God and those they previously served. And so he's warning them that they cannot be promoted from servants to master. Once a servant, always a servant in the church. And so Jesus is saying that the apostles' self-diagnosed lack of faith is nowhere near as big a problem for the future of the church as the possibility that they might lose the will to serve. They might actually lose the will to serve altogether and assume the role of master instead of a servant. And so his message is, once a servant, always a servant in the church. I wonder if we need to think bigger now, because the teaching in Luke's Gospel makes even more sense if we read it in the context of other similar teaching in the other Gospels. So in Matthew and Mark's Gospel, there is this moment where Jesus says to his disciples, you might have heard this before, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And in John's Gospel, John doesn't have that, but John has something similar. After washing his disciples' feet, Jesus says to them, now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. So the big idea? Jesus did not come to be served, but to serve. And Jesus' disciples cannot move beyond Jesus' example. No servant is greater than the master who comes as a servant. And then Jesus picks up this idea in Luke by saying that a servant cannot come in from the field expecting to be treated as a master. Once a servant, always a servant. But where's the freedom? Where's the freedom here? Because this feels so heavy and restrictive. Where's the freedom here? Jesus was all about setting people free. So how can we make sense of this heavy teaching? Here are two ideas that I just offer to you. Ideas that have helped me make sense of the passage. Firstly, Jesus shows us humanity at its best. And secondly, one servant can have many seasons of service. So let's take the first one first. If human beings are created in the image of God and Jesus Christ is God made flesh, the image of the invisible God, as Colossians 1 talks about it, then we can look to Jesus to unlock the mystery of being human. Jesus shows humanity at its best. A document from the Second Vatican Council, I know you can handle this, a document from the Second Vatican Council, and it uses the gendered language of the time, but it puts it perfectly, in my opinion. Christ, the new Adam, fully reveals man, or human beings, to themselves, and brings light to his most high calling. I'll read that again. Christ, the new Adam, fully reveals man to himself and brings light to his most high calling. This doesn't just mean that Jesus was a really good human being, but that Jesus, as God's eternal Son, preceded creation and was the blueprint and means by which God created us. Check out Colossians 1 for more about that. And if Jesus, the blueprint of humanity, did not come to be served, but to serve, and invited his disciples to follow in his way, then when we serve like Jesus, we are actually going with the grain of our human nature. And there is great freedom in that. We can find deep satisfaction and joy in serving God and others. The writer and theologian Friedrich Buechner put it like this: the place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. Service can bring us to that place where we're happy tired. Have you ever been happy tired before? Where you're tired, but you have this deep gladness because you've given the world a gift that was yours to give. You've served in a way that was yours to serve in. You're in step with Jesus at that time. Humanity at its best. And there is freedom when you're going with the grain of your nature. Secondly, there is freedom because one servant can have many seasons of service. I began this morning by telling you about a season in my life when my service in the church looked different. My service was not obvious. It wasn't on the platform. It was showing up for people, being there for people, praying with people. The church may as well have given me a Henry Hoover. And in fact, that would have given me done a lot of good as well. Luckily, I used the Henry a little bit here. But it was humbling being part of that group, just being part of that group. And it shaped who I am today. And if we think of Jesus' life, I love thinking of Jesus' life like this. He had different seasons of service. Most of his life was spent in Nazareth. Have you ever contemplated that? That 30 years of his life was spent in Nazareth, working as a carpenter, making, fixing, restoring everyday objects and parts of people's homes, doors, frames, roof beams. Then he had to let go of that, much like the autumn trees with their leaves. He had to let go of that so he could enter into that ministry of teaching and healing. And then he had to let go of the ministry of teaching and healing so that he could go to the cross and die for the forgiveness of sins, a form of service in itself. So Jesus served through the seasons of his life. And in each season, service looked a bit different. Just as the servant in Jesus' story goes from ploughing and shepherding to serving at the table, Jesus went from carpentry to caring for the sick and wayward to crucifixion. One servant can have many seasons of service. And I wonder if this shines light on service in the church. So here we are, Worthing Baptist Church. Often, I've noticed, things go wrong when we are not sensitive to the necessary change of seasons in service. We keep serving in the same way for as long as we possibly can, either because of others' expectations or of our over-attachment to a role or form of service. But then, when a person can't do it any longer because they're bored or exhausted or physically no longer able to do it, they can sometimes lose the will to serve. Not always, but sometimes lose the will to serve altogether. Or they might leave the church because they feel unappreciated. Or they might go to another church because they're so burnt out, they just feel they need to receive and not give. And I get that. I've seen it all before. I've seen all of those. But all of that could be prevented if we thought about service in terms of seasons. If we thought about what kind of season we're in and how God might be calling us to serve in that season. And so there's great freedom here. Loads of freedom here for each of us to find a way of serving that is a good fit for the season we're in and that meets a real need inside or outside the church. This is not just about the church, this is outside, beyond as well. So back to the 4 seasons of the year that we looked at in the all-age talk. It might be that you're in a spring-like season of life. You've got time and energy, loads of it, time and energy, and you want to experiment with different ways of serving to find out what is a good fit for you. That might be you. I picture that like sowing seeds and seeing which will grow. Not quite sure what will be your way of serving. If this is you and you'd like to serve more at Worthing Baptist Church, you could meet with Mike and me and we could have a think about some opportunities, what those seeds might be and things to try out. But it might be that you're in a summer season of life and your life is full to the brim with life and colour. And you might have many commitments and possibly feel a bit overwhelmed. You might be able to serve at church, but it might be in a way that requires little to no preparation at all, so that you can just turn up and serve. Equally, you may not be able to take anything extra on, and the invitation could be simply to come to the things you already do outside the church, inside the church. Come to the things you already do with a renewed attitude of service inspired by Jesus. That might be the call, the invitation for you if you're in that summer season of life. It might be that you're in the autumn kind of season of life. And like the trees with their leaves, you're aware you need to let go of ways you've served in the past. If you're able to let go, there might be energy and time that can be used for less obvious forms of service. That was the season I was in 9 years ago when I started at that placement church, and I had to let go of leading music and preaching so that I could serve by simply showing up for people. That was the season I was in. Or it might be that you're in that winter kind of season, you're feeling weak. Anyone feel weak this morning? You're feeling weak and exposed to the storms of life. You might be experiencing unexpected limitations in life. Over the years, I've had many conversations with people in their 80s and 90s who really miss serving in active ways in the church and outside the church. Really miss it. They might be in a nursing home, or they might be in their own home, but with carers or food delivery people coming in regularly, or family checking on them, or friends or neighbours checking on them. But what I've noticed is that these people are often in an excellent position for service, an excellent position. There are people coming to them to help them, to serve them. And there is an amazing opportunity for them to serve those that are serving them. They can encourage, they can smile, they can promise to pray, they can listen, they can invite to church, they can talk about what God means to them more freely. When suffering people talk about the love and faithfulness of God, everyone sits up and listens. When suffering people talk about the love and faithfulness of God that they've experienced, everyone sits up and listens. This is a gift that those in the wintry season of life can give. This is a way of them serving. So my encouragement for those in a wintry season of life would be, think about where you are, that incredible place that you are. Who is right there in front of you to serve? So to draw this together, Jesus said to his apostles that losing the will to serve was a bigger problem than their perceived lack of faith. Jesus did not come to be served, but to serve. And his disciples cannot go beyond their master, who came as a servant. Once a servant, always a servant. But there is freedom here, because by serving, we're actually going with the grain of our human nature, revealed in Jesus Christ, and that one servant can have many seasons of service. And we can avoid boredom, exhaustion, and over-attachment to a role in service by paying attention to the season of life we're in and asking God to clarify how we can serve in that season. So my prayer for you is that you serve in that place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. Amen.